Good afternoon. I'm Don Verrilli, former Solicitor General of the United States under President Obama and current member of the Board of Directors of Equal Justice Works. Today, I have the great pleasure of joining you all for the second day of the 2021 Equal Justice Works Conference and Career Fair. Equal Justice Works is an organization near and dear to my heart. I've been a strong supporter for many years. Equal Justice Works is the nation's largest facilitator of opportunities in public interest law. Over 2,000 Equal Justice Works fellowships have been awarded to lawyers committed to fulfilling our nation's promise of equal justice for all. And this afternoon, we're honored to welcome one of my true heroes, Vanita Gupta, whose career epitomizes devotion to public interest and to public service. Vanita now serves as the Associate Attorney General of the United States, the third-ranking position in the department. She's a trusted advisor to the Attorney General and a participant in the most important decision-making at the department. I really got to know Vanita and admire her during her stint in public service in DOJ when she was the acting Attorney General running the Civil Rights Division. Now, in between those two stints in government service, Vanita served as President and Chief Executive Officer of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's oldest, largest, and most diverse civil and human rights organization. She was a leading national voice on the debates over police reform in the wake of George Floyd's murder, on voting rights, and on other issues of paramount importance. Vanita began her legal career as an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where she successfully led the effort to overturn the wrongful drug convictions of 38 individuals who were ultimately pardoned by Texas Governor Rick Perry. Thanks so much for joining us in conversation today, Vanita.
I'm honored to be here with you.
So our audience today is made up of hundreds of passionate law students aspiring to public interest careers, but finding one's way into a public interest career from law school can be quite a challenge. Can you talk a little bit about your time in law school, what inspired you to take the public interest route, and how you found your way from law school into the public interest world?
Yeah, so first, thank you, Don, for doing this. It's always an honor to be in conversation with you. I didn't have a linear path. I had parents who had immigrated from India to the United States and always kind of believed in the promise of this country. And they may take umbrage in this now, but they always told me that I needed to read the news and be up to speed on what was happening. And I think I took that to heart. And it was hard for me kind of growing up not to feel moved by injustices and to feel like it was incumbent on everyone to figure out what we could do about it. It was maybe perhaps also naive and idealistic, but that strain remains with me a little bit today. But I went to NYU Law School in part because it has such a strong public interest program. And while I was there, I did a number of law clinics, which exposed me to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where I had the real privilege of spending a year, as you know, working with some of the finest lawyers in the country and working on cases involved with children and adults who were accused of crimes, and really got a lot of exposure to what was happening in the criminal justice system at the time. And it was through that path that I decided to look out for a fellowship to try to get into a public interest organization. I wanted to be at LDF, and I was lucky to get a fellowship that launched my career there. It isn't always easy as a young law student who wants to go into a public interest organization to know exactly what the path was, but I was lucky to have a public service outfit at the law school. I think a lot of law schools have those now, and was able to get a fellowship where I spent the first 2 years of my legal career at the Legal Defense Fund, and then I decided and was able to stay another 3 years. So in total, spent about 5 years at the Legal Defense Fund doing a whole broad range of work, but mostly centered on criminal justice issues.
And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. One thing that really struck me when I first got to know you when you came into the department was that you had developed this extraordinary reputation for yourself as a really serious, determined advocate for police reform. But you also had the trust and respect of leaders in the law enforcement community, which was really quite something to be able to accomplish both of those things at once. And so why don't you talk a little bit about that, about your work in Texas on these kinds of reform issues for LDF and how it was that you managed to achieve both of those things at once?
So the first cases that I had out of law school, I actually encountered them or the problems in them very serendipitously. I was at a annual civil rights conference that LDF throws in Virginia and saw a documentary that had been made by the William Kunstler's daughters about this drug sting that had happened on July 23rd, 1999. This was in 2001. I was watching this 10-minute documentary, and the documentary just told a story of a drug sting that had happened where, on the uncorroborated word of a narcotics officer funded by federal funds, had resulted in the arrest of over 46 individuals, 40 of whom were Black, 3 of whom are Hispanic or Latino, and 3 who were white. And the arrests all happened on the uncorroborated word of this officer who had no evidence to back up his word. So no marked money, no video, no surveillance, nothing that you would think would be, accompanying a properly conducted drug sting in the small town. And lo and behold, as people tried to go to trial to prove their innocence, they were getting sentences of 20, 45, 60, 99, in one case, 341 years for very low-level allegations of drug crimes. And there was something seriously wrong. This was a town of 5,000 people, 350 African Americans, and to have 40 of them arrested on one day suggested that either the town everyone was on drugs in this town, or something had gone wrong. And so I didn't have much legal experience to speak of. I watched this documentary and worked at this amazing place that said, okay, you've put down a 10-page memo of the things that you think could have happened here. Why don't you go down and investigate? And so with my little to no experience, I went down and I just started talking to people. I met with local lawyers who had been given $250 flat fee for felony cases. There was no public defender system in the state of Texas at the time. And the local judge would refer cases out to private lawyers and give them a flat fee. And you really had to stay in the good graces of this judge to be on the court appointment list. And so I started to just talk to them. I met with family members of those who had been arrested that day. And their sons and daughters and brothers and sisters now were all over the great state of Texas because of the way that the system worked post-conviction. And I just started to realize that something had gone horribly wrong in this drug sting. And there was a local investigative reporter who had done a lot of the legwork that we used to build the cases. And this was an area of law that's habeas law, incredibly arcane. Most lawyers can't make heads or tails of it. And there's also no right to counsel, as you well know, in this stage of people's criminal proceedings. And so it was really important for us to be able to identify lawyers, build up a team, and tell a whole different story of what happened in this small town in 1999. And we were fortunate that we were able to dig up some really crucial facts in some of the individual cases that began to turn the narrative around. This had been a drug sting that had been celebrated in the state of Texas, and the law enforcement officer had won awards for his conduct in Tulia, and that quickly began to unravel as we began to uncover facts of what had happened. So this was the launch of my career. I ended up working with some of the top law firms in the country, recruiting lawyers, because I just couldn't handle all of these cases. I barely knew what I was doing. I was kind of relying on the clinical experience that I got at the law school and on some common good sense and some relationships that I built with law firm partners around the country. We built up a formidable team, and then we were able in 2 years to get to exonerations and then a civil settlement to try to bring some sense of justice into people's lives for these wrongful convictions. So these were my first cases, and I think it exposed me to a lot, obviously, about the criminal justice system. This was 2004 when the exonerations happened. The country at that time, we had 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population, and the problem of mass incarceration was not one that enough people were focusing on. And so it was something that I wanted to dig into and work. And there was an incredible opportunity to work on the right and the left on these issues. This was a time when state budgets were really crunched, and I began to build a lot of coalitions, on kind of right-left coalitions, groups that were forming Right on Crime in Texas, and conservative and progressive activists were beginning to come together on these issues. And then I was able to find a lot of alliances with law enforcement as well on these issues. I think there are a lot of folks in law enforcement who believed that we had kind of put all of these social problems at their feet: substance use disorder, mental illness, things that should not necessarily, where the criminal justice system couldn't be the first and only answer. And it was through some of that common ground that I've been able, I think, to really find a lot of alliances. Folks don't always agree on everything, but where we can find common ground, I think it's been incredibly fruitful and important, and we continue to build on that.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary accomplishment. Well, you and I got to know each other really here at the department during the Obama administration, where you were really a force in the Civil Rights Division, accomplished so much. But I'd love to get your take. I think our audience would be interested in your take on what it was like to make that transition from public interest lawyer to public servant in DOJ, and then what your sense is of that time in your career, your accomplishments, the challenges, what it was like.
So you can imagine, Don, my surprise when I was first invited to interview for the position of the head of the Civil Rights Division. I had spent my entire career suing the government, and I got that call as Deputy Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. And when I first got the call, I kind of looked at the phone and was like, do you know who you called? But I think it was a testament to President Obama and then Attorney General Eric Holder that they wanted somebody who had spent her career in civil rights and who had been pushing on some of the key issues of the day, on voting rights, on criminal justice reform. When I got the call, it was in the immediate aftermath of Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, and communities were really roiled around the country around policing and racial injustice, public safety, community police trust. And I came into the Justice Department acutely aware of the tremendous challenges that we faced. It was important to me to reach out to law enforcement almost immediately, because there was no way that, even as it felt like there was more and more polarization between law enforcement and the communities that they serve, that we weren't going to solve the problem of police violence or support law enforcement efforts to keep our communities safe without there being, dialogue and engaged problem solving. And we weren't going to solve this problem through body-worn cameras alone. We actually had to do some of the tough work of understanding what is at the root of trust. It's got to be that there's accountability when things go wrong, that there are systems in place for law enforcement around training and supervision, that there is ongoing 365 days of the year trust building between community leaders and law enforcement, and not just waiting for a critical incident. And so it was really the honor of my lifetime to be able to serve in that moment where policing issues definitely predominated my tenure. There was, every week, it felt like some viral video that was causing unrest, distress. But it was also a really important time, because I felt like there were so many law enforcement leaders that wanted to be at the table, that really wanted to think about what it meant to have de-escalation philosophy in policing, what it meant to ask the hard questions around racial discrimination in policing, how to keep communities safe, while understanding that some of the decisions that get made around priorities and the criminalization of mental health and substance use has not always served law enforcement well, and has not always served communities well. And so this is unfinished business, clearly. But I do think that this opportunity to work at an institution that has an obligation, but also the trust in communities around the country, the Justice Department, to help bring the tools and levers that we can to bear to both ensure public safety and constitutional policing it remains kind of part of my mission today, and I think a really important mission of this Justice Department.
Yeah, and it was really amazing. I must say that with all the focus you just described, you also made extraordinary gains in enforcement of civil rights laws on lending and employment and voting.
LGBTQ rights. I got to work with you on so many of these issues, to be in the building the day of the Obergefell decision. And when doors were open to actually where the court had said, underscored the dignity of all people and recognizing same-sex marriage that day, and to be in the Justice Department when we were working on voting rights and to ensure that no person on the basis of race would be discriminated against or prevented from exercising their constitutional right to vote. A lot of these challenges remain with us today. It's as the history of this country has shown, we have to always be vigilant on these issues, but it's a magical thing and a thing that comes with a lot of responsibility to be part of this institution that is really trying to lean forward into these issues and to protect the dignity and safety of
everyone. Right. I was just going to say now, after your great stint at the Leadership Conference doing really important work, you came back. You came back into one of the highest positions in the department. And you started talking about this already, but how do you see the next few years shaping up? What are the chief challenges you see, and what do you hope to try to accomplish during this time?
There's a lot. It's a much broader purview to be as the associate. And I think a few fundamental things, I think making sure that the Justice Department remains hewed to the rule of law, free from partisan influence, but also is making a meaningful difference in people's lives through the enforcement of our laws. I used to think of antitrust laws as this incredibly arcane, Byzantine, technical area of the law. But it's incredible to me now being in this position, the degree to which it can be the source of economic justice and can actually level the playing field and make sure that the price of beef and chicken and dairy, the food on our tables is actually, something within reach for all families, that we can have health care that is within reach, that competition actually helps promote an open and level playing field and an open economy for all. So, I'm learning every day that I'm on this job, but I think that we've got enormous opportunity right now to advance on antitrust and economic justice. I think we have a lot of work to do on criminal justice reform and policing issues still. Voting rights obviously is core to all other rights. All rights are derivative from the right to vote, and we have seen, real challenges in that regard. And we are continuing to use all of the tools at our disposal to combat voter suppression and ensure that everyone has the right to vote. And we have to do all of these things, whether our tools are hampered or not, whether Congress acts or not. It is incumbent on us to enforce our federal civil rights laws. The Civil Division is representing all of the government agencies and seeking to advance their priorities. So on the environment and climate justice, obviously a really important issue. It's hard for me to choose just one thing. Thank God this place is filled with the most incredible lawyers who have been working at the career level and are working to enforce our laws day in and day out. But there's a lot to do.
I bet. Well, I have hours worth of questions that I could ask you, but I want to give our audience a chance to participate here. So we're going to open up for questions now from members of the audience on Zoom.
Hello, thank you for taking the time to be here today. My name is Eric Roten. I go to Elon University School of Law in North Carolina, and I'm a disaster resilience student fellow this summer. My question is, with the country opening back up, what do you think are the most pressing issues we are going to face as a society as a result of the pandemic? Also, is there anything that has inspired you as a result of the pandemic that gives you hope as things start to open back up?
I think the pandemic in so many ways has highlighted or exacerbated pre-existing disparities. And we saw it in access to healthcare during the pandemic. We saw it in access to housing now. There's been a lot of concern about the evictions crisis, given the ending of moratoria and what we're going to do there. And so I think that it is maybe kind of lifting up some of these problems that perhaps for too long have been invisible. And we need to be able to come together now with solutions that will get us in a better place over the long term and not just as a response to the pandemic. There has been obviously a lot of inspiring things that have come out of this, namely, obviously, the heroism of so many of the frontline workers that didn't stop while the rest of us were quarantining. And I think recognizing kind of the services that they bring in our communities and maybe trying to do what we can to uplift those professions, whether it's teachers or police officers or hospital workers and healthcare workers. But my hope is that we will recognize that while the pandemic kind of exacerbated a lot of these problems, the solutions that we need to be putting in place may be more structural. And I'll use an example of that. You know, for a long time in too many parts of the country, civil legal aid is underfunded. There isn't a right to civil legal aid, and yet for people who've been so impacted by the pandemic, either they are at risk of losing housing or they haven't had access to health care or whatever else, that civil legal aid lawyers and representation can make a real difference in keeping people in their homes, in making sure that they have access to the health care that they need and the like. And so I hope that, you know, as one example, that this pandemic will then be able to force us to invest in civil legal aid more holistically and to be able to reach for solutions that will be in place long after the pandemic is over.
Also, what advice do you have for young lawyers trying to make change in society, and what inspires you most about the future of the legal field? Thank you.
So, you know, what always inspires me about law students and young lawyers is the enormous appetite for change and hope. I think you can't do public interest work without having a deep well of hope. It is easy to be cynical in these times. It is easy to shut down conversation. It's easy to throw one's hands up and say, well, there are no solutions or these problems are too big. But when I think of Equal Justice Works fellows, and I have known many of them, I think of the incredible appetite for change and hope and believing that one can use the legal profession as a way to lift people up and to bring dignity into people's lives where that may not be. And so I am ever hopeful. It's the only way that I do this work every day. But I think we rely on young people to think of new solutions, creative solutions, things that we never thought were possible, and to kind of hold that North Star for us.
And that's exactly what inspires me about Equal Justice Works, too.
Yeah, every day. It's and every fellow has an inspiring story that way.
Really true.
Hello, my name is Shelby Paul. I am a 2L at Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law at Case University. I am the class of 2023, and I'm also a Rural Summer Legal Corp Fellow. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm sure we all greatly appreciate it. The question that I would like to ask is, what advice can you give to myself and others who are passionate about pursuing civil rights law, whether it be with navigating jobs, organizations to join, or becoming a civil rights prosecutor?
My advice to young folks who want to enter the legal profession and engage in public service is to keep an open mind and to not feel like there's only one path to doing this work. Sometimes people have the 5-year plan and 10-year plan, and more power to them. I am definitely among those who had no multi-year plan. But I think it's really important to choose places where you actually like the people that you will be working with and you look at what they're doing every day. You're going to spend a lot of time at work and figure out whether you actually want to be around these folks as well as whether you connect with the mission of the organization. It's a mistake just to go with the mission of the organization because any organization is as good or as effective as the people that are in it. But keep an open mind and get out of your comfort zone. Some of the most important things I have ever done in my own career have been really uncomfortable, have taken me into new environments, new climates, forced me to engage with people who didn't agree with me at all and where I was able to find common ground. And so I hope that these are some of the things that young lawyers will be able to imbue as well.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Susan Florent, and I'm a student at the University of Michigan Law School, graduating in 2022. I was a recipient of the 2021 Regional Public Interest Award for the Midwest region. Conversations about public interest law careers often focus on the federal government and well-known nonprofit organizations in major cities. While these career paths are important, can you speak to why it is equally important to encourage students to pursue public interest careers in smaller communities and how the legal community can better support rising public interest lawyers in their work for less resourced organizations across the country?
I am really excited to get that question because I think it is so important that Equal Justice Works fellows and young lawyers are going to rural communities, to smaller communities, because the reality is that people are in need everywhere in this country. And if there's only a focus on large urban areas, we can leave communities behind, and that's to our own detriment. And I think there's so much to be gained and experience to be had in places where there are far fewer nonprofit organizations, where the needs are greater, where you can actually be closer to the communities that you're serving sometimes. And so I can only encourage people as much as possible to seek out careers or jobs in rural or smaller communities for that reason, and then to be able to amplify the stories of what's happening in those communities and to ensure that our policy reflects those needs as well.
Good afternoon, Associate Attorney General Gupta. My name is Ricardo Gomez, and I'm a third-year law student at the Catholic University Columbus School of Law, and I was a Rural Summer Legal Corps Fellow this past summer. My question to you is, considering the current political climate, do you believe that political affiliation plays a critical role on the opportunities that may be afforded to young attorneys within the federal government? And if so, how can this be mitigated? Thank you.
So political affiliation shouldn't play any role in opportunities at the federal government. In fact, the diversity of the career men and women who serve in the federal government and the political appointees at times in the richness of that word is really important for the success of the mission. And I think strongly, obviously, you have to agree with the mission of the agency where you might want to serve. I think that seems like an important predicate for employment, but otherwise, the strength of the federal government in working here really is in its diversity.
Thank you so much for speaking with us, Associate Attorney General Gupta. My name is Kelechi Alfredi-Bokwe, and I am a current 3L at St. John's University School of Law. My question for you is, how have your experiences at the ACLU impacted your approach to community policing at the Department of Justice?
I think all of my prior experiences, whether it was at the American Civil Liberties Union, at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, have informed my own views on community policing. I think community policing is an incredibly important strategy. It's one that has actually been underinvested, and at times the lack of focus on community policing has promoted more of a warrior philosophy in policing rather than the guardian one. And a lot of folks in law enforcement have been kind of turning the needle on this and saying we need greater investment in community policing strategies. And that's not through kind of one particular tactic or another. That really is about a philosophy of policing that is rooted in community, where communities play a role in influencing the priorities and public safety missions in their communities, that they're working with police departments and sharing information about crimes, and witnesses are cooperating with law enforcement, but you have to have trust and you can't have public safety without trust. So community policing is an important strategy for keeping our community safe. And there's no question that my own experiences working in civil rights organizations trying to push for greater accountability in law enforcement has played a role in my views of the importance of community policing. But I also am really gratified to be working on these issues now, where I think there's broad consensus about the importance of this strategy of policing.
Well, thank you, Vanita. Those are extremely thoughtful answers to our audience questions. You continue to be an inspiration to me, and I'm sure that's true for the members of the audience, the aspiring public interest law students out there. So thank you very much for joining us for this keynote session. And thanks to all of you for tuning in to this keynote session, and please enjoy the rest of the conference and career fair. Thanks very much.
Thank you.